British Airways Flight 431 from London, Heathrow to Manchester, was settling into its afternoon routine when what would become one of the most talked-about incidents in aviation customer service began to unfold. The Boeing 737 was nearly full, carrying the usual mix of business travelers, tourists and locals heading home to the north of England. In seat 14C, a tall figure in a grey hoodie and black tracksuit bottoms sat quietly reading a book, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. To any casual observer, he appeared to be just another passenger, perhaps a construction worker heading home after a job in London, or maybe a university student travelling on a budget. His clothes were clean but casual, his demeanour relaxed and unassuming. This was exactly how Tyson Fury preferred to travel when he wasn't required to make public appearances. The retired heavyweight champion had learned that sometimes the best way to enjoy a peaceful journey was to blend in completely, to become invisible among the crowd of ordinary travellers who filled Britain's domestic flights every day. James Whitmore had been working as a flight attendant for British Airways for 3 years, and in that time he had developed very definite opinions about passenger classifications. At 28, he carried himself with the kind of self-importance that came from working for a prestigious airline, and he had little patience for passengers who didn't meet his personal standards of appropriate air travel presentation. As James moved through the cabin conducting his routine safety checks, his eyes fell on the figure in 14C. The combination of tracksuit, hoodie and baseball cap immediately triggered his internal alarm system. In James's worldview, people who dressed like that were precisely the type who caused problems on flights. Loud, disruptive, likely to drink too much or argue with crew members. "Excuse me, sir," James said, approaching Tyson's seat with a tone that managed to be both professionally polite and subtly condescending. "I need to verify your boarding pass. I want to make sure everything is in order." Tyson looked up from his book, a biography of Muhammad Ali that he'd been enjoying, and met James's gaze with mild curiosity. "Of course," he said in his distinctive Morecambe accent, reaching into his jacket pocket to produce his boarding pass. James examined the document with theatrical thoroughness, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "This says seat 14C, he said slowly, "but I'm having trouble understanding how someone with your particular presentation ended up in this section of the aircraft." The words hung in the air with unmistakable implication. Several nearby passengers had begun to pay attention to the interaction, sensing the tension that was building. "I bought a ticket," Tyson replied simply, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious insult. "Same way everyone else on this plane did, I imagine." James's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Yes, well, sometimes people make mistakes when booking online. Sometimes they end up in sections they're not really suited for. Are you absolutely certain you shouldn't be seated further back in the aircraft?" Mrs. Agatha Fairchild, a dignified woman in her 70s sitting across the aisle, looked up from her newspaper with obvious disapproval. She had been flying for longer than James had been alive, and she recognized blatant discrimination when she saw it. "The gentleman has shown you his valid boarding pass," she interjected, with the kind of crisp authority that came from decades of not tolerating nonsense. "Surely that should be sufficient." James turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but cabin crew are trained to ensure passenger safety and comfort for everyone aboard. Sometimes that means addressing irregularities." Irregularities. Mrs. Fairchild's voice carried decades of experience dealing with pompous young men. "What exactly do you consider irregular about a paying passenger sitting in his assigned seat?" But James was no longer listening to her. His attention had returned to Tyson, and his voice carried a note of growing authority as other passengers began to watch the unfolding drama. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me," he announced loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I think there's been a genuine mistake here, and we need to sort out your proper seating arrangement." Tyson remained seated, his book still open in his lap. "Mate, I'm in the right seat. I paid for this specific seat, and I'd prefer to stay here if that's all right." "I'm afraid it's not all right," James replied, his voice taking on the kind of theatrical authority he had seen senior crew members use with difficult passengers. "Passengers need to be seated appropriately, and frankly, your appearance suggests you might be more comfortable in a different section of the aircraft." The conversation was now drawing attention from passengers throughout the middle section of the plane. Some were reaching for their phones, sensing that they might be witnessing something worth recording. Others simply stared in fascination at what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. Marcus Pemberley, a self-important businessman traveling in seat 12A, decided to involve himself in the situation. I have to say, I appreciate crew members who maintain standards, he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. It's refreshing to see someone ensuring that passengers understand appropriate behavior for air travel. His comment drew nods from several other travelers who seemed to approve of James's heavy-handed approach to passenger management. The atmosphere in the cabin was becoming increasingly charged, with clear divisions forming between those who supported the flight attendant's actions and those who were growing uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Elena Rossetti, an experienced Italian flight attendant working the same service, had been observing the interaction from the galley area. Something about the situation troubled her deeply, but airline hierarchy dictated that she couldn't directly contradict a colleague without clear justification. "James," she called out diplomatically, "perhaps I could assist with resolving this situation?" But James was clearly enjoying his moment of authority. "It's under control, Elena. Just ensuring all passengers are properly situated for everyone's comfort and safety." Ben Ashford, a university student in his early 20s, found himself growing increasingly angry as he watched the interaction unfold. "This is completely mental," he muttered to his traveling companion. "The guy hasn't done anything wrong." James overheard the comment and turned toward Ben with obvious irritation. "Sir, I'll thank you not to involve yourself in crew operations. We're trained professionals handling a routine passenger services matter." "Routine?" Ben's voice carried the indignation of youth confronted with obvious injustice. "You're harassing someone for wearing a tracksuit." The word harassing seemed to hit James like a physical blow. His face flushed red as he realized that his actions were being interpreted as discriminatory by an increasing number of passengers. "I am not harassing anyone," he said loudly, his professional composure beginning to crack. "I am ensuring that all passengers are seated appropriately, according to airline policies and social expectations." Tyson had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. He had experienced prejudice before, as a member of the traveling community, as someone from a working-class background, as a person whose size and appearance sometimes made people uncomfortable. But this particular combination of class prejudice and assumption-making was remarkable even by his standards. "James," he said quietly, using the flight attendant's name tag to address him directly, "I think there might be some confusion here. I'm not causing any problems for other passengers. I'm not being disruptive or inappropriate. I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for reading a book." "The issue isn't what you're doing now," James replied, his voice carrying a note of condescension that was becoming more pronounced with each exchange. "The issue is that airlines have certain expectations about passenger presentation and behavior. People who dress like you are statistically more likely to cause problems during flights." The statement was so brazenly discriminatory that it drew audible gasps from several passengers. Mrs. Fairchild actually stood up in her seat, her face flushed with indignation. "Young man," she said in a voice that could have cut glass, "that is absolutely the most disgraceful thing I have ever heard a professional say to a paying customer." But James was too far committed to his course of action to back down now. "Ma'am, you may not understand the complexities of airline passenger management." "I understand bigotry when I hear it," she interrupted sharply. "And what you've just said to this gentleman is nothing more than plain, simple prejudice." The cabin had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, with every passenger now fully aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The tension was palpable, as James found himself caught between his desire to maintain authority and the growing realization that his actions were being viewed unfavorably by a significant portion of his audience. It was at this moment that Sarah Blackwell, the senior purser, emerged from the forward galley where she had been reviewing passenger manifests. She had been only dimly aware of some kind of discussion taking place in the cabin, but the unusual quiet that had descended over the normally chatty aircraft caught her attention immediately. "Is everything all right back here?" she asked, her experienced eyes quickly taking in the scene: a standing flight attendant, a seated passenger, and dozens of other travelers, all focused on what was clearly a significant confrontation. James turned toward his supervisor with obvious relief. "Sarah, I was just addressing a seating irregularity. This passenger appears to be seated in the wrong section." Sarah looked at Tyson, then at the boarding pass James was still holding, then back at her subordinate. "What exactly is irregular about a passenger sitting in his assigned seat?" "Well, it's not just about the seat assignment," James said, lowering his voice slightly but still speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's about passenger presentation and ensuring appropriate standards for all travelers." Sarah's expression grew very serious very quickly. In 15 years of airline service, She had seen discrimination complaints destroy careers and cost airlines millions in legal settlements. "James, I think you need to explain exactly what you mean by passenger presentation." It was a question that would force James to either explicitly state his prejudices or back down from his position. And as every passenger in the surrounding seats leaned forward to hear his response, Tyson Fury sat quietly in 14C, still holding his book, still maintaining his dignity, and still waiting to see how this extraordinary situation would resolve itself. The question from Sarah Blackwell hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. James Whitmore found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify his actions to his supervisor, while surrounded by dozens of passengers who were now paying rapt attention to every word of the conversation. "Well," James began, his confidence wavering slightly under Sarah's steady gaze, "airline policy requires us to ensure that all passengers maintain appropriate standards of dress and behavior that don't disrupt the travel experience for other customers." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "James, I've been with this airline for 15 years and I'm not familiar with any policy that allows crew members to relocate passengers based on their clothing choices. Could you help me understand which specific regulation you're referring to?" The question was delivered with the kind of professional precision that came from years of dealing with delicate situations. Sarah knew exactly what was happening here, and she was giving James an opportunity to step back from what was clearly becoming a discriminatory incident. But James, perhaps sensing that retreating now would undermine his authority in front of the passengers, chose to double down on his position. "It's not about specific regulations," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "It's about using professional judgment to maintain the comfort and safety of all passengers. When someone's appearance suggests they might not understand appropriate airline etiquette, it's our responsibility to take preventive action." The words were barely out of his mouth before Ben Ashford stood up in his seat, his young face flushed with anger. "Are you serious right now?" Ben's voice carried the indignation of someone witnessing obvious injustice. "You're basically saying this man can't sit here because of how he's dressed? That's textbook discrimination." "Young man," James replied, trying to reassert his authority, "I'll ask you to remain seated and allow cabin crew to handle this matter professionally." But Ben wasn't backing down. "Professionally? There's nothing professional about judging someone based on their clothes. The guy is sitting quietly reading a book, bothering absolutely no one, Mrs. Fairchild, who had been listening to the exchange with growing disgust, decided that silence was no longer an option. "In my 74 years, she announced in a voice that carried throughout the cabin, "I have never witnessed such blatant prejudice from an airline employee. This gentleman has been nothing but polite and cooperative, and you're treating him like a criminal." Marcus Pemberley, still convinced that supporting the flight attendant would somehow elevate his own status, chose this moment to make his position clear. "I have to disagree," he said loudly. "Airlines have every right to maintain standards. If passengers can't dress appropriately for air travel, maybe they should consider other forms of transportation." The comment drew immediate and hostile responses from several other passengers. A middle-aged woman in 16B turned around to face Marcus directly. "And who made you the fashion police?" she asked sharply. "The man is wearing clean clothes and minding his own business. What more do you want?" Elena Rossetti, who had been watching the situation with growing alarm, finally decided that she needed to intervene. "James," she said quietly, approaching her colleague, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." But James was now too committed to his course of action to accept a face-saving exit. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter of maintaining appropriate standards for all passengers." "What standards?" The question came from an unexpected source, a businessman in 13D who had been working on his laptop throughout the flight. "The gentleman has shown his boarding pass, he's in his assigned seat and he's not bothering anyone. Exactly what standard is he failing to meet other than your personal dress code preferences?" The question highlighted the fundamental weakness in James's position. He was being asked to articulate specific, policy-based reasons for his actions, and everyone in the cabin was beginning to realize that he couldn't do so. Tyson had been listening to this entire exchange with a mixture of amazement and sadness. He had encountered prejudice before, but rarely so publicly and with such obvious support from bystanders who recognized injustice when they saw it. "James," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the cabin despite its calm tone, "I think perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. I'm not trying to cause any problems for you or anyone else. I just want to sit in my seat and finish my book." "It's not about causing problems now," James replied, his voice taking on a note of frustration as he realized that the situation was not developing as he had expected. "It's about preventing problems before they occur. Experience teaches us that certain types of passengers require more attention than others. The phrase, certain types of passengers, landed like a bombshell in the cabin. Even Marcus Pemberley looked uncomfortable as the discriminatory implications became impossible to ignore. Sarah Blackwell's face had gone very pale as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. "James," she said in a voice that carried unmistakable authority, "I need you to step away from this passenger immediately." "Sarah, I really think—" "That wasn't a suggestion," she interrupted. "Step away now." But James, perhaps sensing that his career was already in jeopardy, made one final attempt to justify his actions. "Fine," he said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear, "but when this type of passenger starts causing problems later in the flight, remember that I tried to address the situation proactively." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and in that moment, something shifted in the cabin atmosphere. What had begun as one flight attendant's prejudiced assumptions had become a public spectacle that was forcing every passenger to confront their own biases and assumptions. Mrs. Fairchild stood up again, her elderly frame rigid with indignation. "Young man," she said in a voice that carried absolute moral authority, "you should be ashamed of yourself. Absolutely ashamed." Ben Ashford was on his feet as well. "This is unbelievable. You're literally discriminating against someone based on their clothes." But it was Elena Rossetti who provided the moment that would change everything. She approached Sarah Blackwell and whispered something in her ear, something that made the senior purser's eyes widen with obvious shock. Sarah looked at Tyson more carefully, studying his face with the kind of recognition that was beginning to dawn. Then she looked at James, and her expression became very serious indeed. "James," she said in a voice that had gone completely professional, "I need to speak with you privately, right now." As they moved toward the galley, the cabin buzzed with conversation as passengers discussed what they had just witnessed. Some were outraged by James's behavior, others were uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation, and a few were beginning to suspect that there was more to this story than they initially realized. Tyson remained in his seat, still holding his book, still maintaining his dignified composure, despite having been subjected to public humiliation based on nothing more than his choice of comfortable traveling clothes. He had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, everything was about to change in a way that would transform this flight from a routine journey into a lesson about assumptions, prejudice, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance. The conversation between Sarah and James in the galley was brief but intense, and when they returned to the cabin, Sarah's expression suggested that the situation was about to take a very different direction. Sarah Blackwell's face was ashen as she returned from the galley, her 15 years of experience in airline customer service having prepared her for many challenging situations, but nothing quite like this. Behind her, James Whitmore followed with the expression of someone who had just been told that his world was about to collapse. Elena Rossetti had done what James should have done from the beginning. She had actually looked at the passenger manifest and cross-referenced it with the boarding passes. What she had discovered in that simple check had prompted her urgent whisper to Sarah, and now the senior purser was faced with managing what was undoubtedly going to become a major incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced to the cabin, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that immediately commanded attention, "I need to address the situation that has been developing here." The entire middle section of the aircraft fell silent. Passengers who had been engaged in heated discussions about discrimination and airline policies turned their attention to the senior crew member, who was clearly about to make an important announcement. Sarah approached Tyson's seat with visible apprehension. "Sir," she said quietly, though her voice carried far enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I need to apologize on behalf of British Airways for the completely inappropriate treatment you've received today." She paused, clearly struggling with how to address what had happened without making the situation worse. "James," she continued, turning to her subordinate, "would you like to explain to our passengers exactly who you've been harassing for the past 15 minutes? James's face had gone from red to white as the full implications of his situation became clear. I didn't realize, the passenger manifest didn't. The passenger manifest clearly identifies our guest in 14C as Mr. Tyson Fury," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the cabin like an announcement. "Perhaps you're familiar with that name." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence throughout the aircraft as passengers turned to stare at the man in the grey hoodie who had been so publicly humiliated by the flight attendant. Phones appeared in hands, as people realized they had just witnessed one of Britain's most famous athletes being treated like a potential troublemaker based purely on his casual clothing. Mrs. Fairchild was the first to react audibly. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying a mixture of shock and vindication. "Mr. Fury, I am absolutely mortified by what you've been subjected to." Ben Ashford let out a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "Brilliant. Just brilliant. You've been treating the heavyweight champion of the world like he's some kind of hooligan because he's wearing tracksuit bottoms." The murmur of conversation that began spreading through the cabin was a mixture of amazement, embarrassment, and anger on Tyson's behalf. Passengers were pulling out their phones to look up photos, confirming what Sarah had just announced, and realizing that they had witnessed something that would undoubtedly become a major news story. Marcus Pemberley, who had been so vocal in his support of James's actions, had gone completely silent and was staring at his hands as if they contained the answers to life's greatest mysteries. James stood in the aisle, looking like he wanted the aircraft floor to open up and swallow him entirely. The magnitude of his error was becoming clear not just in terms of the embarrassment he had caused to a famous passenger, but in the realization that his discriminatory behavior had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people. "Mr. Fury," Sarah continued, her professional composure struggling against obvious personal mortification, "I cannot adequately express how sorry I am for this incident. Your treatment today has been completely unacceptable and contrary to every principle of customer service that this airline represents." Tyson closed his book carefully and looked up at Sarah with an expression that was impossible to read. The entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see how Britain's most famous boxer would respond to having been publicly humiliated by an airline employee. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and completely free of the anger that everyone expected to hear. "Sarah, isn't it?" he said, reading her name tag. "Thank you for the apology. I appreciate that." He stood up slowly, his considerable height becoming apparent as he unfolded from the airline seat. Several passengers instinctively reached for their phones as they realized they were about to witness what could be a historic confrontation. But instead of the explosive response that James clearly feared, Tyson turned to the flight attendant with something approaching compassion. "James," he said gently, "I want you to know that I don't hold any personal grudges about what happened here today." The statement was so unexpected that it drew audible gasps from several passengers. This was not the response anyone had anticipated from someone who had been so publicly humiliated. "But," Tyson continued, his voice taking on a tone of gentle instruction, "I hope you'll use this experience to think about how you treat people in the future, not because of who they might be, but because every person deserves basic respect, regardless of how they're dressed or where you think they come from." James's face was crumpled with shame and embarrassment. "Mr. Fury, I cannot apologize enough. I made assumptions that were completely wrong and treated you in a way that was," he struggled for words, "inexcusable." "We all make mistakes, James," Tyson replied, extending his hand to the flight attendant. "The important thing is learning from them." The gesture of forgiveness was so unexpected and gracious that it seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the cabin. Passengers who had been angry and indignant found themselves witnessing an act of remarkable grace under pressure. Mrs. Fairchild dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Mr. Fury, your response to this situation shows exactly the kind of character that makes champions." Ben Ashford shook his head in amazement. "That's incredible, man. I don't think I could have been that cool about it." Even Marcus Pemberley, who had been studiously avoiding eye contact since Tyson's identity was revealed, looked up with something approaching respect. Elena Rossetti approached with obvious emotion. "Mr. Fury, on behalf of all the crew members who believe in treating every passenger with dignity, thank you for your grace in handling this situation." As the aircraft began its descent into Manchester, word of what had happened spread throughout the plane. Passengers from other sections came forward to express their admiration for how Tyson had handled the situation, and more than a few asked for selfies with the man who had just demonstrated that true strength sometimes meant choosing forgiveness over retaliation. James spent the remainder of the flight in deep conversation with Sarah about airline policies, discrimination training, and the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect. It was a conversation that would lead to significant changes in how the airline trained its staff about unconscious bias and customer service. As they prepared for landing, Tyson returned to his seat and opened his book again, but Mrs. Fairchild leaned across the aisle one final time. "Mr. Fury," she said quietly, "I've been flying for over 50 years, and I've never seen anyone handle ignorance with such dignity. You've taught everyone on this aircraft Something important today." Tyson smiled at the elderly woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Fairchild, but honestly, James taught me something too." "What's that?" "That sometimes the best way to fight prejudice isn't with anger or retaliation. Sometimes it's just by showing people that their assumptions about who you are and what you're worth are completely wrong." As Flight 431 touched down at Manchester Airport, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. But the conversations throughout the aircraft weren't about connecting flights or ground transportation. They were about what they had witnessed, a masterclass in dignity, forgiveness, and the power of responding to discrimination with grace rather than anger. James Whitmore would later tell colleagues that the flight changed his entire perspective on customer service and human interaction. Sarah Blackwell would use the incident as a case study in airline training programs, and Tyson Fury would continue to travel in tracksuit bottoms and hoodies, secure in the knowledge that his worth as a person had nothing to do with what he wore and everything to do with how he chose to treat others, especially those who had treated him poorly. As the passengers filed off the aircraft, many stopped to shake Tyson's hand or thank him for the lesson in grace they had just witnessed. It was, several would later say, the most educational flight they had ever taken.